Hello and welcome to the Imprint Weekly Podcast. I'm John Kelly, Senior Editor of the Imprint, a daily news site covering child welfare and youth justice around the country. You can read all of our coverage at imprintnews.org or check us out on Facebook or Twitter at the Imprint News. You can also sign up on our homepage for our free weekly and monthly newsletters. And for professionals in child welfare and youth justice, subscribe to our Youth Services Insider section for a closer look at news on business policy and practice. The Imprint Weekly Podcast is also a member of the Safe Camp Audio Network. You can check out our show page and all of Safe Camp's other great podcasts at safecampaudio.org on the web, at Safe Camp Audio on social media. Today is our monthly headlines episode, so I'll get into that in a minute. First, a quick plug for anyone interested. We are hosting a free online discussion next month called Trump, Kids, and Families Inside White House Watch. Imprint reporters will take you inside the newsroom for a look at their coverage of the many changes at the federal level under the new administration. Since taking office in January, the Trump administration has taken aggressive actions to reduce the federal workforce focused on child welfare. It's terminated or frozen hundreds of millions of dollars in grants aimed at supporting youth in foster care who have been involved with the juvenile justice system. Meanwhile, Congress has moved major cuts to Medicaid, while the Trump administration is poised to propose significant cuts to discretionary spending in 2026. Our reporters will share key highlights from this national reporting that the Imprint has put together in our series called White House Watch. You can join Trump, Kids, and Families completely free on Thursday, November 6th, 10 a.m. Pacific Time, 1 p.m. Eastern Time. I will put the link to register for free in the show notes. All right, let's start in Washington, D.C., where unless things change before you listen to this, we are in the 11th shutdown of the federal government in our nation's history. The majority of those are, historically short, as little as 4 hours in some cases, but the more recent history predicts a longer ordeal. The record holder is 35 days, and that was, I think, the most recent one, which occurred in Trump's first term. So what does a shutdown mean for youth and family services and supports for families? Here are just a few ways that the field of child welfare, youth justice, and other connected things might be impacted here, especially if this goes on for a little bit. Big federally funded benefits, like think about the Temporary Assistance for Needy Families program, SNAP, food stamps, women, infant, and children nutrition programs. They're exposed in that they no longer are presently funded. The feds might have some funds left over to distribute. I think that is definitely the case with WIC and to a shorter extent with SNAP. Or states might not have spent down what they have currently, and that might be true with the Temporary Assistance for Needy Families. There might be states with some money kicking around in the fund still. But eventually, if the shutdown kept going, they would run out. And depending on their own finances, states could and historically have, just try to figure out how to borrow or shift things around to keep essential stuff like that going. But that is very much predicated on the expectation of what has historically happened in shutdowns, which is that once the shutdown is over, pretty much everybody that was impacted by it gets made right, whether that's, funding programs to states or federal workers who have been furloughed. The expectation has always been that they are going to be made whole after the ordeal is over. And I'll link to a story from Governing, which is a great news outlet. Jewel Pattison Gordon reported on sort of the uncertainty of that proposition now. She quotes Lisa Parshall, fellow at the Rockefeller Institute of Government, in her story, and I'm just going to read from that real quickly. States will see no new funding for most mandatory programs funded through the appropriations process, although they are entitled to reimbursement later. Still, Parshall says there's, quote, less certainty this time around about whether those reimbursements will come through and in what kind of a timely fashion, especially for liberal jurisdictions. So I think what she sums up there is we don't really know the extent to which the uncertainty and what's being talked about in Capitol Hill is going to impact whether or not states behave in a different way. And again, this could, by the time you hear this, the shutdown could be over and, we're off and running on the next thing from Washington. But, that's one factor. Second, of course, is the federal workforce, which, as we've discussed before here on the podcast, has been cut down already, particularly in the Department of Health and Human Services world. As far as what we cover, justice, I haven't really seen much evidence that, the Office of Juvenile Justice has been cut back or anything like that. The administration's indicated that it believes it could and may use the shutdown to conduct mass layoffs. I caught something that shared some projected, allocations of those that showed thousands of more jobs could be cut back, both at HHS and at Justice. There's an obvious impact for that, of course, on the people working in these agencies, some of whom have tremendous background and experience on a pretty complicated process for funding family services and stuff like that. For states, it would mean an even thinner line of communication between the federal government and states on the business side, just managing payments, reimbursement, answering questions about the, complicated process of federal funding and policy, and also just simply handling current grant competition. And that's something where there's definitely going to be an impact if this goes on for a while, or really even not for that long a period of time, is in the realm of grant competitions, particularly when it comes to the Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention. So we had talked on the podcast, I think last month, about the fact that, we were heading into the final 30 days of fiscal year 2025, and there really hadn't even been a grant competition announced out of OJJDP. That certainly, towards the end of September, we did finally start to see some of those available notices for funding for things like mentoring and preventing trafficking and finding homeless and runaway youth and all kinds of other things that OJJDP funds. We started to see those notices go up with deadlines that were pretty tight. It looked like, to me, a lot of them, the applicants had to turn those around by mid to late October. Now, when we asked for comment on whether or not the Department of Justice felt that it was going to be able to, both compete out and then distribute all the money from 2025, their view was, yes, we have an additional year of authorization to handle that. So any of the money that was for fiscal year 2025, which is now over, we are within our rights and able to put that money out in 2026 as well. But that requires people to be working and the government to be open. So the longer that the government stays closed, the longer that the kind of starting gun on doing the review around those grants will take. So, and again, that's before you get to the fact that all we're talking about to prevent this shutdown is a continuing resolution. We haven't even really seen Congress move towards negotiating or talking about any sort of like fixed federal funding for 2026. So it does feel like we're headed towards a point where they're going to be getting this 2025 money out the door at the Justice Department just in time for a theoretical 2026 process to begin, with no certainty around that either. So it does seem quite messy when you look at it that way. Now, that said, there is some indication, I think, from another grant program that we had talked about pretty recently. We had some folks on the show to talk about the Runaway and Homeless Youth Program and how that had been significantly changed and put on an extremely short timeline as well. That money comes out of the Health and Human Services budget. There is some indication from that experience that the process of making federal grants, both for 2025 and maybe going forward for the Trump administration, is not going to be the months-long process that we are used to. That Runaway and Homeless Youth money was finally announced. Everybody was, if you recall this, everybody was really worried they weren't going to do it. And so finally the money came out. They gave everybody a really short timeline to get their applications in for it in a year where they were changing the rules in some pretty significant ways. They, people pushed back, advocates for the programs pushed back, and they got a little more time. Anyway, the turnaround, I have heard, nothing public has been, released by the Department of Health and Human Services yet, that grant winners have started to be notified privately by HHS. Again, they haven't put out any press release or any announcement as to who won those runaway and homeless youth grants. Those grants were made as compared to regular order in a lightning fast fashion. Anyway, you could be listening to this on Thursday and the shutdown would have ended 2 days ago. But if this lingers, those are just a few things to keep your eye on as potential impacts for the field. Let's move on to some national data. Now, 4 months ago, the Trump administration released the long-delayed 2023 national data on foster care that comes out of the Adoption and Foster Care Analysis and Reporting System. At that time, they put up this kind of first ever dashboard. Like, this stuff always used to come out in a PDF that you could, upload and then just sort of see the annual numbers on things like how many kids are in foster care, how many entered or exit, some of the circumstances around why they entered, where they were living, what type of setting, all that stuff. And there was sort of an Excel spreadsheet, if you knew where to look, sort of towards the bottom of the AFCARS reports, where you could kind of see aggregated state-by-state data over a longer period of years. They went this year to this dashboard system, which is kind of hosted on Tableau, which does give you more data elements for sure. You can dig down and kind of cross-reference by race and ethnicity, by age range within all the kind of parameters that I just talked about. So that was 4 months ago. And at the time, they did say that the dashboard system and what they were trying to do would facilitate quicker timelines around getting the numbers up, which was, music to my ears as somebody who tries to cover child welfare in real time. The numbers are always, or have always been, pretty delayed beyond the year that we are in. And the 2023 report had become comically late to the point where it was like, what is the value of this information in an ever-changing world? But it does appear that they meant it, at least for this year, because the 2024 numbers are out just 4 months after the release of those 2023 numbers. I will post all the links you need to get to the dashboard, to get to the static report if you just want to read the PDF. But let's just take a look at some of the top line numbers in here. So the new data shows that the number of youth in foster care was down again this year to 328,947 in 2024. That is a 3% decrease from the previous year, and it is now down 25% from the recent peak of 437,000 kids who were in foster care in 2018. So that marks a 6-year decline here in the number of youth who are in foster care that began before COVID-19. It really started in 2018, and so those 2 years leading up into COVID, and has now continued well beyond the social isolation measures prompted by the pandemic that definitely led to people being worried, okay, we're just not going to have any sort of sightline on a lot of kids, and then that will artificially push down the number of youth who are in foster care. I don't think it's credible to say that anymore. It's not that there were certainly less reporters and there were certainly less reports. That's there's no doubt about that. But to say that the entirety of this downward trend in foster care as a result of that is just not credible at this point, given that it did start before COVID and has continued well beyond, the sort of primary seasons of it. Now, that drop in the total number of youth in foster care continues to be fueled by a reduction in the amount of entries into foster care that offsets a continuing decline in the number of kids who are actually exiting the system. So entries in this year declined by 2%. In 2024, exits slowed by 4%. I should just note here also, Washington and Wyoming aren't in the mix so far for this dashboard and the numbers that come out of it. The federal dashboard notes that Washington and Wyoming did not submit data for the dashboard. I have heard from a Washington official that they have submitted their AFCARS data, but there's formatting requirements for the data to be visible on the dashboard, and that's the issue. So it all sounds like it will be resolved sometime soon, but this is like 2 years now, 2023 and 2024, where we just don't have information on those two states. So when I compare back to 5 years, I'm kind of backing them out and just showing the states where we can do apples to apples. So we continue to see less and less kids entering foster care. We also are seeing less kids leave it, but the drop in entries has just far exceeded over the course of, 5 or 6 years now, the slowing of the exits. The other unknown variable here is hidden foster care. So you could look at the 6-year kind of time horizon and say, oh, well, the number of kids in foster care is down 25%. That's only true if every kid who is going into formal foster care as we know it, which involves, a court at some point along the line approving a removal that was either made on an emergency or a petition, standpoint, and they're placed in, legal custody into foster care. It's only really true that it's a 25% decrease if all those kids are staying home. And we know that in all likelihood, a good chunk of them are being diverted to kin in what is kind of come to be known as hidden foster care, the shift of physical custody of a child by CPS without the formal legal changes involved with this court-approved foster care system. And so hidden foster care is, certainly I will link to our kind of running series of stories that we've done on it. There's lots of concerns about the due process on the front end of that. A lot of parents being sort of told, well, we could move your son to Aunt Sally and do a case services plan or something like that, or we'll be back tomorrow to take them into foster care. That's not something that happens in every circumstance, I'm sure, but that is the fear, is that it's some kind of, coercive proposition at the front end. Same for relatives, knock on the door pretty late at night. Hey, if you can't take, your daughter's kid in, we're going to have to put them in foster care, things like that. So as we've covered, and I'll link to in our show notes, this is something that Congress on the federal level and some state legislators are working to get more clarity on and basically take this out of the realm of hidden foster care and call it something else. I don't know what, kinship diversion or something like that. Just a few other noteworthy trends in the AFCARS numbers. Reunification, the percentage of youth who exit foster care to reunify with their parent or caregiver, it started to dip below 50% for the first time in 2017. It reached a new low of 44% in the 2023 report. So only 44% of the kids who were exiting foster care were going back home. In 2024, cause for some optimism, I guess, exits to reunification ticked back up to 45%. And then we also saw just kind of a continuation of this overall trend away from the termination of parental rights and the use of adoption as a form of permanency. So that last report from 2023 found that the number of children in foster care whose parents' rights had been terminated dropped 29% in a single year. That's just between 2022 and 2023. And that the number of kids for whom the stated goal was adoption had dropped 23%. This year's report, certainly it doesn't have those big 20% plus drops, but it shows the trend continuing. Youth whose parents' rights were terminated dropped another 8%. Plans for adoption dropped 10%. And then actual exits from foster care to adoption have declined significantly as well. It was down 6% from 2023 on this report that just came out, and compared to the historic peak of 66,208 adoptions from foster care that was achieved in 2019, we are down 29% from that. Again, I'll link to our kind of write-up of all this, as well as where you can see the dashboard and play around with it yourself. All right, last kind of national newsy thing, then we'll take a break and come back, hit on some recommended reading from both the Imprint and from other outlets. Some good news for advocates of home visiting. That is sort of a model or a strategy of service where paid professionals are going into the homes of new or expecting moms and parents to provide them with some level of support and counseling to better prepare them for that. So good news is that there's a major evaluation of the federal program that funds those at north of $400 million per year, and it has produced good results. So the My Hope Mother and Infant Home Visiting Program Evaluation looked at the four largest, I'm going to say, I think they're all in the largest tier of programs that benefit from the federal program called Maternal, Infant, and Early Childhood Home Visiting, and that's called MICV. That's just, if you hear people refer to MICV, that is what they are talking about. So this evaluation found, and I'm going to quote from the findings here, quote, statistically significant and positive effects of home visiting for the 5 research questions that measured maternal and family well-being outcomes, end quote. And here were those questions that they were looking for positive effects on. Maternal coping strategies and parenting behaviors that could be improved through direct interaction between parents and visitors. 2, maternal mental and behavioral health. 3, parent-child interactions. 4, a constellation of outcomes related to conflict, violence, aggression, and maltreatment. And 5, families' economic circumstances. So they did find statistically significant and positive effects in all of those buckets. Now, specifically on child maltreatment, the study acknowledges that the body of previous work, like different evaluations and studies over time, really had provided scant evidence, or really did not explore the nexus between these 4 models in a lot of cases and child maltreatment, with the exception of Healthy Family Americas. That was one of the 4 that is part of this evaluation. They are the one that most clearly draw a line between their program and preventing child maltreatment as a kind of core goal. So they have had that as part of evaluations over the years. I think the study notes that there were 24 studies where that link was examined, and 3 of those 24 found positive effects. So what My Hope did was they found that home visiting, quote, had an overall statistically significant effect on reducing conflict, violence, aggression, and maltreatment. And they added later in the findings section, I'm quoting here again, given the increased focus of home visiting programs on reducing outcomes related to family conflict and violence, this statistically significant and favorable finding fills a large gap in the evidence, particularly across the 4 models involved in My Hope. So I will link to the very long report, which is called Beyond Early Years, that looks at all these home visiting programs and what they have brought to bear, if anybody wants to read that. All right, we'll take a quick break and come back with some stories from around the country.
Want to stay on top of the latest in child and family well-being? Sign up for Child and Family Wellbeing at a Glance, a free weekly newsletter from Sellers Dorsey designed for professionals working to improve the lives of children and families. Each week, you'll get curated news clips from across the country, plus insights and resources from our experts, all in one quick read. It's built to keep you informed, save you time, and help you focus on making an impact. Subscribe today at sellersdorsey.com/newsletter. That's sellersdorsey.com/newsletter.
All right, we'll close out here with some recommended reading, and I'll start with Nell Bernstein's latest for us on the youth justice aspect of what's going on in Washington, D.C. So I'm sure everybody has become vaguely familiar, at least with what's going on, but in August, citing a crime emergency in the city, President Trump invoked Section 740 of the D.C. Home Rule Act that initiated a federal takeover of the Metropolitan Police Department. This has involved the deployment of like 2,000 National Guard troops who are stationed in tourist zones all over the city, who also assist with, logistics and administration for the local department. People are pretty familiar with all of that kind of public-facing stuff that's involved. And, in more recent days, the president and members of the administration have talked about deploying National Guard and doing similar things in other cities. But it's actually in D.C. also involved legislation from Congress on items related to youth justice that the administration has voiced support for. So following a vote in September, the House advanced legislation that would allow children as young as 14 to be tried as adults. Currently 15 and over is the mark. So it would be essentially adding 14-year-olds to the mix of youth who could be tried as adults for their crimes. It also reversed prior law that extended access to the juvenile and to the family court system through age 24 for young people accused of certain crimes. Now, another bill that is headed for the House floor soon that is championed by Trump's attorney for the District of Columbia, Jeanine Pirro, that would repeal Washington, D.C.'s 2016 Incarceration Reduction Amendment Act, better known as a Second Look law, which allows those convicted of serious crimes as youth to petition the court for a sentence reduction after serving at least 15 years. And House Majority Leader Steve Scalise is pushing on both of these bills. This is a quote from his statements on it. In order to lower crime in our nation's capital, we must acknowledge the threat these young people are posing to public safety. Teenagers who commit serious and violent crimes such as murder, sexual abuse, and armed robbery must be held accountable for the pain they inflict and the danger they pose by being tried as adults, which I would just editorially suggest does apply at least to the first legislation I referenced, which has to do with who can be exposed to in going in one direction, being tried as an adult, or who might get sent back towards the youth justice system if, professionals involved were thought that was the right thing to do. The second look law really has much more to do with how much progress somebody has made as a prisoner. So the people that are being referenced there in this bill that they're trying to repeal are people that have spent 15 years already doing time for pretty serious offenses. So it doesn't really seem to line up logically as their policy aim does with the first set of laws. As Nell suggests in the story, a 2024 survey of victims of violent crime by the Alliance for Safety and Justice found that most reject long sentences. 3 out of 4 said they believe that the most effective way to reduce crime is to create more jobs and housing rather than impose long sentences. I will include a link both to Ms. Bernstein's story for us, as well as a special series that we did, written by the great Sylvia A. Harvey, on that second look law and one young person in particular who ended up benefiting from it. The earliest listeners of this podcast heard an episode called Detained for Skipping Schoolwork. It was our 3rd episode ever, and it was with Jody Cohen, who is a reporter for ProPublica. We talked about her COVID-era story of a Michigan teenager who was just identified as Grace in the reporting, who had been detained basically for skipping a virtual class. And this is like in the height of COVID. She was taken out of her home and put into a public detention center for skipping this virtual class. And that case is at the center of a new push to require better training and competency for lawyers assigned to represent youth in court, according to reporting by Lauren Gibbons in the news outlet Bridge, Michigan. In Gibbons' story, Kristen Staley, who is the executive director of the Michigan Indigent Defense Commission, noted that it took an actual appellate case to reunite Grace, the girl who was detained for skipping the class, with her mom. And she said of the lawyer involved, and this is a spicy quote, "There was technically counsel standing there, but having a law license and a heartbeat doesn't mean that you're effective," end quote. So I'll drop a link to our podcast interview with Jody for anybody that wants to kind of hear the backstory on that case. And I'll drop a link to the story in Bridge, Michigan, if you want to learn a little bit more about what exactly advocates are seeking in terms of quality of counsel for the youth justice side. We do see that story quite a bit on the child welfare side of the coin. It's the first time I've seen somebody looking for legislation around, competency and quality, not just a guarantee of counsel on the juvenile justice side. The Imprint's Jordan Anderson recently reported on a change in Georgia law around an issue that really touches both child welfare and youth justice, and that is chronic absenteeism, which is generally defined as missing 10% of school days, and the rate of it across the country has skyrocketed really before the pandemic and then also afterwards. So on the child welfare side of chronic absenteeism, it might in some states get pegged as educational neglect and expose the parents and the kids. In that way, the lack of attendance, of course, might be a harbinger of worse happening at home. On the justice side in Georgia and elsewhere, truancy is a status offense, which is just a term that references things that kids do that if an adult did them, they wouldn't be a crime, but because they're kids, there are things like truancy or running away from home and things like that. So truancy is a status offense, and that can open up a youth to system involvement all the way up to incarceration. Sort of the path to get there would be maybe they're chronically absent, so they're labeled a truant. The judge puts them on probation and orders them to attend school. And if they violate that court order to attend school, the judge could lock them up if they wanted to. But one thing that cannot happen to a chronically absent student now in Georgia, Anderson reports, is being expelled. A recent law that just went on the books banned that recourse for the school system and forces schools to instead interrogate the underlying causes and try to deal with it. And this is a quote from John F. Kennedy, that is his name. "This isn't just about reducing numbers," Kennedy said. "It's about understanding why students aren't showing up for class. What support are they missing? How can we respond in ways that are compassionate, strategic, and effective?" So it will be very interesting to see what this leads to. The interest for the schools in expelling kids who are chronically absent is obvious. It does not look good for them if their kids are chronically absent, and one way to get a chronically absent kid off your books is to kick them out of school. I think the question now is, what do schools do instead? So I think it's one of those laws where you got to follow it for a while and see if it's leading to good outcomes, maybe unintended bad ones. We'll see for sure, because we have a reporter there. I want to call out a couple of stories around early childhood initiatives that are going in different directions. This first one is from reporter Chabeli Carranza of the news outlet The 19th, and she is reporting on New Mexico becoming the first state in the nation to provide childcare to all residents regardless of income, which is a policy that will take effect next month in November. Just some details from Carranza's reporting here. It was really interesting to me. So the state has an early childhood education and care department that got a budget increase of $113 million in the most recent legislative session. And that took the operating budget up to nearly $1 billion, half of which goes to, child care payment supports. And this all kind of generated this increased spending on early childhood education because the state established this fund in 2020 with money that was earmarked for early childhood. And, basically as a result of tax collections from oil and gas, that fund has grown from a $320 million investment to $10 billion. So it ballooned up to the point where it could be used for something on this grand a scale. Advocates had kind of led the charge in the intervening years after the fund was started to pass a constitutional amendment that ensured that a portion of the fund went specifically to universal child care. So that's sort of how we got there. It was also interesting that, as Carranza notes in here, this comes with some improvements for child care facilities. It establishes like a $13 million loan fund to construct and expand facilities and launch a recruitment campaign for home-based providers and to raise sort of the minimum wage for childcare staff up to $18 an hour. And on the other side of the coin, we have Washington State, where looming deficits and uncertainty over federal funding have prompted across-the-board cuts this year. Earlier in the legislative season, each state agency had to identify cuts that would slash 6% from their budgets. I am basically just relaying what is in the story in the Imprint about this from our Michael Fitzgerald. So read the story for more detail. But that amounted to about $150 million reduction for the Department of Children, Youth, and Families, which is their child welfare system, but also oversees, early childhood as well. So instead of digging into foster care services at all, the agency kind of highlighted early childhood as the focal point for its cuts. And that has really cut into this Fair Start for Kids Act, which is the state's, $1.1 billion expansion plan for public preschool access that was launched a couple of years ago, at least for now. And just by way of kind of providing some color and some face to what's going on in Washington with early childhood, Fitzgerald interviewed Catherine Dennis, who works with Catholic Charities serving Central Washington. They lost about $1 million from their $17 million early learning budget. Here's what Ms. Dennis had to say to Fitzgerald about this. Quote, "We used to have a teacher aide, support specialist, a floater to provide relief for breaks, behavioral support, and wraparound support for parents. Now," she said, "with fewer bodies in the room, there's more emphasis on management of the classroom rather than effective interactions." So it's not only about less kids being served, which also is certainly happening. There is a early childhood education and assessment program in Washington that's going to serve 2,000 fewer kids than it did last year. But it's also just about what people are going to do to cut back and meet budget requirements. for the kids that are actually there. All right, last one for you. Let's end on a good note. I wanted to raise up Jeremy Loudenbeck's excellent profile for the imprint of Luke Wood, who is the president of Sacramento State University, working to make his campus more attractive to and supportive of youth who are either still involved in foster care or who have exited that system. And Wood has layers of experience that propel him to that mission. He was himself adopted from foster care. He made it to college at Sacramento State along with his brother. They experienced housing instability while they were on that campus, and now he runs the school. You can read the story to hear some of the things Wood and the school are doing specifically to make it a welcoming and attractive place to youth who have experienced foster care. But here's a quote he gave to Loudenbeck that really sums up his worldview, and this is Wood I'm quoting here. "When I see these students here, I just don't see them as students in the same way as my other students. I truly see them as my brothers and sisters. And I want to make sure that there's an institution that's standing up and saying to all the foster youth across our state and across our country, this is the place that actually wants you and is willing to do the support that's necessary to ensure you succeed." All right, that is going to do it for this week's episode of the Imprint Weekly Podcast. The Imprint Weekly Podcast is a production of the Safe Camp Audio Network, which is a division of Fostering Media Connections. Please visit safecampaudio.org on the web or at Safecamp Audio on all major social media. This podcast is produced and mixed by Christine Anjoko with music by Luke Giroux and Cyrus Elia. If you enjoyed this episode, we would love it if you would consider subscribing or giving us a 5-star rating on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you download your podcasts. And we would greatly appreciate if you consider supporting our work here on the podcast and in print. Small donations from our listeners and readers go a long way towards helping us grow and cover more great stories in child welfare and youth justice. To support us, it is super easy. Just visit imprintnews.org/donate. You can follow The Imprint on Twitter and Facebook by searching the handle @TheImprintNews, and you can visit us on the web at imprintnews.org or email us at tips@imprintnews.org. I'm John Kelly, and we'll see you next week.